We are talking about expensive games, and so of course that means complaining about spending money, because if there's one goal us retro gamers have, it's to collect games and get them for the cheapest price possible. So naturally, these expensive games can put us at odds with ourselves. We really want to get whatever the game is, but we don't want to spend some super high price in order to get it. Let me paint a quick scenario for everyone that I'm sure most of you have been through at some point. So say you're collecting for whatever given system, and you're having a merry old time, just collecting away, finding good deals, getting some of the best games for the console, so on and so forth. And then you run into a game that you really want, and you find out that it costs as much as every game for your system you already have combined. And you're like, oh my goodness, this is like 15 times the price of, the average game that I've bought for this system, or maybe even more, or something crazy. And you're like, oh my goodness, what do? I either have to cough up the money for it, or I have to cross my fingers that I'm gonna find it at like a garage sale or something like that. Spoiler alert, that's probably not gonna happen, especially these days. So what are we to do? Well, if you've watched any of my videos about consolidating your collection, you'll know the trick that I like to use, which is to clean out just a huge chunk of a lot of the games that you would consider kind of crappy from your collection, and then use the combination of all that money to get that one really good expensive game. But say you don't want to sell any of your games, a very likely scenario, then what do? Well, I hate to say it, but in this case, you gotta just pony up the dough and pay for it. Like a lot of you have said in the comments section, sometimes you gotta pay to play, and that's just the case when it comes to this stuff. It's so rare that it's hard to find anywhere where somebody isn't gonna know what it's worth, and so your best option is to just pay, the going rate for it. Now, this is interesting because then the high prices for some of these games are just part of the evaluation you have to make when you decide if you want to buy them or not. It's not just, is this game good or not? It's, is this game good enough to spend hundreds of dollars on? And maybe not even hundreds of dollars. Some games can seem really expensive just at like $50 or maybe even $30 or something like that, depending what the game is. And here's another issue that a lot of us collectors will run into that I feel I should point out. So sometimes some of these really hard to find, rare, expensive, older games will get released on newer consoles. That sounds great, right? What's the problem? Well, a lot of times it's only digitally, so you can't actually collect it. All you can do is download a copy. Now, sometimes you'll get lucky and they will actually release it physically. Sometimes it'll even be in like a compilation with some other games that are related in some way, and that's usually a pretty big win. But a lot of times some of these games just will not be released physically, only digitally. Well, that sucks because then you can't collect it. And so then you're thinking, well, do I want to pay just a little bit of money so that I can at least play it? And technically I own it digitally, but then you don't actually really own it because you don't have a physical copy. And so then you're back thinking, okay, do I want to buy that original super expensive copy? Radiant Silvergun on Sega Saturn is a perfect example of this. You can buy this on Xbox Live Arcade for way cheaper than what this original copy will go for. But the problem is that's a digital only copy. It's through Xbox Live Arcade, and so they never released a physical copy of it. Another thing I should point out is sometimes people just want to play games on the original hardware that they came out on. Now, obviously, Radiant Silvergun was originally an arcade game, but the Saturn port is a very iconic game for the system, and the controller for the Saturn just feels like it was designed for the game. And so that's another factor where sometimes people just want to have that game for the original system it came out for, or that system that it's just really synonymous with. And this is exactly why the prices on some of these older original copies remain super high despite having digital releases on newer platforms. people want to have that original copy. Now, sometimes the price will dip just a little bit when they're released digitally, but it always just seems to be temporary, and then those prices go right back up. Now, of course, the best solution to all of this is to have bought some of these games way back years ago when they were a lot cheaper than they are now. And sure, that's all well and good for those of us sitting at home now who have the games sitting in our collection, but that doesn't really do any good for those people who are still looking for the game nowadays. However, the general trend does seem to be that prices only go up and very rarely go down. So the strategy then becomes to try to buy these games before the price goes up any higher than it already is. Otherwise, you're just crossing your fingers that you'll somehow run across a deal for it, which is very unlikely. It is possible, but it's very unlikely. With that said, prices can go down sometimes. You want to pay attention to trends. And games will eventually plateau, they'll hit their peak, and then it is a possibility that the price could go down at some point, so you want to look out for that. Websites like pricecharting.com are great for that. You can track the trends of a game's price. Alright, but getting back to the question of whether or not these games are worth it for the price they sell for. This is where things get tricky for me, because the way I approach it is that regardless of whether a game is worth the price you pay for it, I need to have certain games in my collection, regardless of that. And so my mindset is I'll figure out a way to get the games that I want one way or another, regardless of if the particular price is worth it. For example, I would tell you that this game is not worth the price it goes for. I don't think it's worth what I paid for it, and I paid a third of what it goes for as of the time of this video, and I would say that it's not worth it. I think it's a really good game, but I do not think it's worth the price it went for. And kind of a funny thing with Panzer Dragoon Saga is that they put these games in these cases that really stress you out, because they're these cases where the disc could just easily just slide right out. Oh my goodness. Just kidding, guys. It was a DVD of Stealing Harbor. Nothing to be worried about. One last point that I'd like to make is that a lot of really expensive games are not necessarily good games. And I'm not just talking about some of the ones that are obviously really bad, but sometimes some really expensive games can be mediocre at best. But because they're so uncommon and rare, they get this mystique about them that makes people think, oh, that would probably be better than I would think it is. Or, you know, they just get this perception that's inaccurate. This has actually happened with me, where I bought a game that was expensive because it just had this aura around it that seemed really cool, and then I got it and just sort of found out that I didn't like it. And another thing is that, you know, because the prices on these games will go up, that say you buy a really expensive game you don't like, if you hold on to it for a while, and I'm not advocating to price gouge or anything, but, you know, be fair selling it, but you know, the price could go up and you could get your money back on some of these bad games. Maybe you have some of these bad games sitting in your collection already, and it might be time to sell them because you realize they're no good. Okay, so that does it for some of my perspective on whether or not expensive games are worth buying or not, but of course I want to hear what all of you have to say. I know that everybody has very different philosophies when it comes to this kind of stuff. Some of us avoid expensive games like the plague, some of us are all about them and really want to get as many as we can, and of course a lot of us are somewhere in between, which is probably where I would categorize myself. Okay, so be sure to leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.